Settle into the quietest position you can find, and let the room around you become pleasantly unimportant. Allow your eyes to close whenever they are ready, while the small sounds of the present drift farther away. Tonight, we are going to spend an unhurried day inside a medieval monastery, beginning in the darkness before daylight and moving only as quickly as an old bell allows. I'm the Yawning Historian. Our monastery is a careful reconstruction rather than one particular surviving house. It belongs broadly to the world of medieval Western Europe, and its daily rhythm follows the pattern of a Benedictine community, though customs changed across centuries, regions, seasons, and individual foundations. No single timetable ruled every monastery, and no single arrangement of stone rooms could contain all the varieties of religious life. This will simply be one plausible day, assembled from a rule, from buildings that still leave their shapes in the ground, and from the ordinary needs of people who slept, rose, worked, ate, prayed, and grew tired. The day begins while it is still night. Outside the walls, the fields have almost no color. A low mist rests near the stream, and the winter grass bends under beads of cold water. The rooflines are black against a sky that has not yet considered becoming blue. Inside the enclosure, the church, cloister, kitchen, dormitory, and store buildings are joined by passages that seem larger in the darkness. A lamp burns in the sleeping place, not brightly enough to banish the shadows, but steadily enough to show a row of resting figures and the pale edges of wooden beds. In the rule associated with Saint Benedict, the arrangements for sleep were practical and communal. The monks were expected to sleep clothed and ready to rise, with a light burning until morning. The rule imagined them sleeping in one place when that was possible, although actual buildings and later customs could differ. Younger members were not to gather in a private cluster of their own. They were placed among elders, where the shape of the room itself encouraged oversight, order, and a certain absence of midnight mischief. The communal dormitory was therefore not quite a modern bedroom, and not quite a military barrack, though it borrowed something from both. At some monasteries, it occupied a long upper chamber beside the church. A stair might lead directly toward the night entrance of the church, reducing the distance between sleep and psalmody. Surviving ruins and restored rooms allow us to imagine timber beams overhead, narrow sleeping spaces below, a few chests, folded cloth, shoes placed within reach, and the long, patient draft that was one of medieval architecture's most dependable residents. The sleeper nearest our imaginary lamp has not been asleep in the deep, private way encouraged by a closed door and a thick mattress. His bedding is modest, the room is shared, and every turn of a neighbor can be heard. Somewhere farther along the row, a man breathes with the soft persistence of a bellows. Another shifts on his bed, then becomes still. Wood gives a small creak as the temperature falls. The lamp flame leans, straightens, and leans again. It would be tempting to turn this interrupted night into a universal theory of medieval sleep. The evidence does not permit anything so neat. Sleeping habits varied according to health, work, household, season, and place. In many observant communities, however, a night office did divide the darkness. The interruption was not an accidental disturbance. It was part of the intended rhythm, written into the life of the community and adjusted according to the season. The rule devoted careful attention to the night office, to the ordering of psalms, and to the amount of time needed for rest before the brothers rose. It did not supply one permanent modern clock time. Medieval hours moved with daylight, local practice, and the changing length of nights. In winter, darkness lingered. In summer, morning arrived sooner. The monastery schedule was measured less by the glowing digits of a bedside clock than by sequence, memory, observation, and sound. Then the sound arrives. The bell does not explode across the compound. It begins as a heavy movement of metal, a gathering vibration, and then a rounded note that passes through timber, stone, wool, and sleep. It is followed by another. The air of the dormitory seems to hold each tone after the bell has finished making it. A person in the field beyond the wall might hear it faintly, softened by distance. In the sleeping chamber, it is immediate, not loud in the modern mechanical sense, but too familiar to ignore. One brother opens his eyes. Another sits up. A third has been awake for several minutes and is privately relieved that everyone else must now join him. There is no need for hurried conversation. Clothing is already being worn or lies close at hand. The rule's preference for sleeping dressed was partly an answer to this repeated necessity of rising together. Belts are settled, hoods adjusted, and feet find shoes in the wavering light. The room changes from a line of sleepers into a quiet procession. The transition takes less drama than a painter might give it. There are stiff shoulders, cold fingers, and the small confusion of a man briefly facing the wrong direction. An older monk pauses before standing fully upright. A younger one folds his blanket with great seriousness and then has to fold it again because one end has reached the floor. These are modest human events, absorbed almost immediately by the long room. Regulated silence helped preserve order, especially at night, but it did not mean that every monk in every order spent every waking hour without speech. Medieval monasteries had meetings, instructions, work, guests, illness, correction, and necessary exchanges. Conversation was particularly restricted in places and moments set aside for prayer, listening, eating under a reading, and sleeping. The dormitory at night belonged firmly to the quiet side of this arrangement. The procession begins to move. The lamp picks out rough wool, smooth patches where sleeves have been worn, and the occasional glint of a buckle. The floor is cold underfoot. If the dormitory has a direct stair toward the church, the brothers descend one after another, each keeping enough distance not to step on the hem before him. The stair treads are familiar even in dimness. Years of use have polished the centers slightly, though the walls remain coarse where plaster has thinned. At the lower landing, the air changes. The church is colder, larger, and more resonant than the dormitory. The smell of bedding and human warmth gives way to stone, old wood, lamp oil, wax, and the faint mineral damp held by thick walls. A door opens. Its hinge complains quietly, then settles. The men enter a space shaped for repeated sound. At one English abbey, later descriptions summarize the community assembling in church 8 times through the day and night. This familiar count belonged to the sequence of communal offices, but the precise arrangement could vary. What mattered in our reconstructed moment was recurrence. Prayer was not reserved for a single weekly occasion. It divided time into portions and continually returned the community to the same shared texts. The brothers take their places. The church does not yet possess the warm, honeyed light that modern visitors sometimes associate with old religious interiors. Only selected areas can be seen clearly. A lamp reveals the edge of a lectern. Another catches the profile of a column and leaves most of the vault above in darkness. Faces emerge in fragments, a brow here, a cheek there, then disappear when the flame moves. The night office begins with practiced words. The voices do not need to be theatrical. They are workmanlike, low, and joined by repetition. One side answers another. A reader gives a passage. Psalms follow in an order that members learned over time, not because memory removed all effort, but because repetition made a road through the darkness. A novice can lose his place. An elder can cough. A page can resist turning when fingers are cold. The office continues. The rule of Saint Benedict paid close attention to how psalms were distributed and how the night office changed according to the season. This was an ideal of structured prayer, not evidence that every house always observed every detail without interruption. Communities were made of people, and people brought illness, fatigue, local custom, administrative trouble, poor weather, damaged lamps, and many other small negotiations. The rules supplied a framework against which the day could be arranged, discussed, corrected, and understood. For the sleepy brothers standing in our dark choir, the framework is also physical. His knees know when to bend. His hands know where to rest. His eyes settle on the same small pattern in the stone. He has heard these syllables before, often enough that they can arrive ahead of deliberate thought. When the community pauses, the silence does not feel empty. It contains the last note and anticipates the next one. Beyond the church walls, the night remains broad. An owl moves from one tree to another without any concern for monastic regulations. Water continues beneath a thin skin of mist. In a nearby village, most hearths are reduced to embers. A dog lifts its head when the bell sounds, considers the matter, and lies down again. The monastery is awake, but it has not awakened the whole landscape. Within the church, the reader's voice continues at a measured pace. Books were valuable objects, and light was limited, so every practical act of reading required care. The page is held at an angle that receives the lamp. A finger may guide the line. The voice moves through Latin phrases familiar in sound, even when individual levels of learning differed. It is possible that one brother is fully attentive, another is fighting sleep, and a third is thinking briefly about the cold draft near his ankle. Religious discipline did not erase the ordinary operation of a human mind. The rule urged reverence in prayer and warned against extending private prayer through unnecessary display. The emphasis was not on emotional spectacle. In the communal office, steadiness mattered. The voices rose and fell. The same stone returned the sound, softening the edges. No one needed a dramatic conclusion. One psalm followed another because another had been appointed to follow. The night office could feel long in winter. Darkness before it was answered by darkness after it. In a northern monastery, winter nights stretched patiently around the buildings, while summer reduced the hours available for sleeping and shifted the arrangement. The calendar of worship interacted with the calendar of sunlight. A fixed modern timestamp would make the schedule easier to print, but less faithful to the world being described. At last, the appointed sequence reaches its end. The final responses settle into the church. Feet move, cloth brushes against wood, and the community begins to leave. The brothers do not burst into conversation as though released from a meeting. The quiet remains appropriate. Some may return toward the dormitory for further rest, depending on the season and the customary ordering of the house. Others may remain briefly in prayer. Our reconstructed day allows the procession to climb again. The stair now feels slightly different because the body remembers descending it only a short while ago. Each step upward requires a little more effort. A hand touches the wall for balance. The lamp in the dormitory still burns, fulfilling the practical instruction that light should remain until morning. It has consumed more oil. Its pool of brightness is smaller, though perhaps that is only the imagination of someone newly returned from a larger darkness. Beds receive their occupants again. Belts are loosened if local practice permits. Hoods settle. Blankets rise and fall. The man who had been breathing like a bellows resumes with impressive efficiency. A novice remains awake for a time, hearing phrases from the office repeat themselves after the voices have stopped. The old monk near him turns once, then finds stillness. This return to bed is one reason medieval monastic sleep seems so close to the theme of our own quiet evening. Rest was not always sealed away from duty. It could be entered, left, and entered again. Yet it would be misleading to claim that everyone slept twice, or that every night followed a flawless pattern. The safe conclusion is smaller. In many communities shaped by regular night worship, sleep had to make room for prayer, just as prayer had to make room for the changing length of darkness. The dormitory keeps the sound of the office in memory. Stone does this in one way, the body in another. A shoulder feels the cold that entered while standing in church. Toes slowly warm beneath cloth. The breath of many sleepers creates a gentler rhythm than the bell. The lamp makes a small amber circle, and beyond it the rafters remain unseen. Morning is still distant, but it has begun its approach. The eastern sky loses the deepest shade of black. The change is too slight to notice from the beds, though a watchful person near a narrow opening might see that darkness now contains the faintest gray. The monastery is resting between appointed sounds. As the light grows, another rising will come, followed by another office. The exact names and sequence used through the centuries were not always identical, but prayer near daybreak drew the community back to church. This time the movement belongs less to the depth of night and more to the beginning of work. The lamp is no longer the only light in the room. Windows appear as pale shapes. The roof beams become visible one by one. The bell sounds again, and the men rise with the knowledge that they are unlikely to return to bed. Cloth is straightened more carefully. Bedding is left in order. The room that held sleeping bodies is prepared to remain empty for much of the day. A brother checks the lamp. Another opens a shutter enough to admit the blue-gray morning. Cold air enters immediately, brisk and entirely impartial. Down the stair, the church receives the community again. The outlines of stalls are clearer. The lectern has a recognizable surface. A thin band of daylight rests along one wall, bringing out worn pigment and patches of lime wash. Night has not ended everywhere at once. It withdraws from the high openings first and remains in the corners. The office around daybreak carries a different texture, though the voices are the same. Bodies are more fully awake. The psalms now join the quiet signs of morning outside. A bird begins, stops, and begins again. Somewhere near the kitchen, a servant or assigned brother attends to a fire. A door bar is lifted. The compound slowly becomes a place of movement rather than a set of dark shapes. Women in medieval religious houses also lived within repeated patterns of prayer, reading, work, communal meals, and, in many communities, communal sleeping arrangements. Their institutions varied as much as men's houses did, and their resources and local circumstances shaped the details. Our imagined procession happens to follow monks, but the broader landscape of medieval monastic life also contained nuns whose days were ordered by many comparable sounds. The bell itself deserves one last quiet moment before daylight takes over. It was not a mechanical clock announcing a perfectly calculated hour to every person within range. It belonged to a system of observation and custom, and the person responsible for the signal needed judgment as well as strength. A cloudy dawn, a longer winter night, or an established local practice could affect the lived timing. What reached the dormitory was therefore not an abstract number. It was a familiar note telling the body what came next. Repeated sounds could organize memory with remarkable economy. One pattern meant rising, another called people toward worship, and later signals would accompany meals or work. Visitors had to learn the sequence. Novices learned it slowly, perhaps following the movements of elders before they understood every reason. A resident of many years might respond before he had fully formed a thought. The bell shaped the day by dividing it, but it also joined one day to all the days that had preceded it. By now the sleeping chamber has begun to lose its nighttime mystery. Gray light reveals repairs in the timber, variations in the plaster, and a forgotten thread clinging to a blanket. The plainness is useful. Beds, lamps, clothing, and stairs were instruments in a routine, not scenery arranged for later tourists. Even the cold had a practical answer in wool, shared shelter, movement, and endurance, though none of these made winter entirely comfortable. For a moment, imagine the dormitory after everyone has gone. The rows are orderly, but not perfect. One blanket has a corner folded under. A bed rope gives a faint sound as it settles. The lamp is attended, and the open shutter admits a narrow strip of air that moves across the floor. The room looks patient, as if it understands that sleep will return after the offices, meals, meetings, reading, and labor have finished their slow circuit. After the office, the cloister walk waits beyond the church. It will guide feet toward the chapter house, the refectory, and the tasks that fill the daylight. For now, there is no hurry to follow. The stone floor holds the last coolness of night. A lamp burns lower, and the new light rests gently on the edge of the page. The bell has done its work without measuring a single minute for us. Sleep has opened, prayer has passed through it, and morning has arrived by degrees. Let the imagined voices fade into the rafters, while the monastery settles into the pale beginning of another ordinary day. Morning enters the monastery by surfaces. It touches the upper wall of the church, rests on the worn edge of a stall, and finally reaches the floor in a long, pale shape. The brothers leave their places after the office and move toward the passage beside the church. Their next destination is not far away. In many Western monasteries, the principal rooms of common life gathered around a cloister, so a person could move from worship to meeting, from meeting to work, and from work to food without losing the ordered center of the house. The cloister was usually an enclosed walk built around an open court. It was not merely a decorative garden framed for peaceful photographs, though peace could certainly be found there. It was a practical system of circulation, a sheltered route, a place for reading or work in some circumstances, and an architectural reminder that the community's activities faced inward toward a shared space. The church commonly occupied one side. Other ranges held rooms for sleeping, eating, meeting, storing, warming, and passing from one duty to another. Plans varied by order, period, landscape, wealth, rebuilding, and local necessity. A Cistercian arrangement preserved at a place such as Netley can help us see one coherent pattern, but it cannot serve as a universal diagram for every Benedictine foundation or every medieval religious house. Buildings grew, burned, settled, and changed purpose. A community might inherit awkward ground, an older church, or walls placed by predecessors. Medieval builders were capable of order, yet they also had to negotiate mud. Our imagined monks step into the covered walk. The air is lighter here than in the church, and the small central court has become visible. It contains grass darkened by dew, a path, and perhaps a modest drain or water feature according to the place. The roof above the walk keeps off direct rain, though the wind can carry droplets beneath it. One section receives morning sun, another remains blue with cold. Feet make a subdued rhythm on the paving. Robes brush the wall. The procession turns a corner, and the change in direction reveals the familiar geometry of the enclosure. To one side is the doorway back into the church. Ahead is the entrance associated with daily communal business. Above, the sleeping range occupies its own level, connected by stairs and habits of movement. The monastery is less a collection of isolated rooms than a sequence learned by the body. The cloister could become a place of memory for someone who had lived beside it for decades. Every stone carried a history too small for a chronicle. A mark near the door recalled a winter repair. A shallow hollow in the pavement showed where many feet had turned. The shadow of an arch moved across the wall at a different pace in June than in December. A novice learned the building as a set of instructions. An elder knew it as a long accumulation of mornings. The brothers approached the chapter house. At surviving abbeys, this room is often recognizable by its position and by the architectural care given to its entrance. The community met there regularly. Readings from the rule belonged to the meeting, along with practical assignments, remembrance, correction, and decisions appropriate to the house. The name gathered around the practice of reading a section or chapter of the rule, though daily business could extend beyond the reading itself. Inside, seating follows the walls or the shape customary to the building. The center is left open. Stone columns may divide the ceiling above, their weight descending through carved capitals into bases that have endured generations of damp shoes. Sound behaves differently here than in the tall church. A voice is closer, more human in scale, and a cough cannot travel into a distant vault to hide. The abbot takes his place. In a Benedictine framework, the abbot held substantial responsibility for teaching, discipline, stewardship, and the health of the community's common life. The rule described his office with both authority and warning. He was to govern different temperaments with judgment and remember that he too was accountable. Actual abbots varied, as all office holders do. Some were capable administrators, some were learned, some were politically connected, and some likely caused the community to practice patience more often than the schedule strictly required. The meeting begins with a reading. The book is opened, and a section of the rule is heard again. Repetition is central to the practice. No one assumes that a text has become unnecessary because it was read last year. A short passage can return under new weather, new leadership, and new problems. The reader's voice moves through the room, while daylight enters through openings that may be glazed, shuttered, screened, or simply narrowed according to the building and period. The sound of the reading joins other morning sounds. Water falls somewhere in the court. A bird lands briefly on the roof and scratches at the surface. From a service area comes the distant knock of wood. These noises do not defeat the room's purpose. They remind everyone that the chapter house stands within a working institution, not outside ordinary material life. After the reading, the day's concerns can be addressed. A task needs assigning. A guest is expected. A roof tile has shifted. A store of grain must be watched more carefully. Someone is unwell and should be relieved of an ordinary duty. The chapter house gathers such matters into a formal setting. This is not a modern staff meeting, though the sensation of listening to a long explanation about a small repair may possess a certain timeless quality. The rule of Saint Benedict allowed an abbot to call the community for counsel on important affairs. Authority did not become democracy in the modern sense. The abbot heard advice and remained responsible for the decision. The rule nevertheless treated counsel as meaningful and warned that useful judgment might come from a younger member. In practice, the manner of consultation depended upon community, century, office, personality, and the matter at hand. One brother speaks when called. His voice sounds unexpectedly large after the quiet walk. He explains that a boundary gate needs attention before livestock discover an alternative interpretation of enclosure. Another knows where timber can be found. A cellarer or other responsible officer may need to organize materials. Offices and titles differed across houses, but every substantial community required people to manage food, tools, buildings, clothing, guests, and the many objects upon which regular life quietly depended. Necessary speech, therefore, had a proper place. Medieval monks are often imagined as if they had taken a single, universal vow never to speak. That picture is too simple. Communities regulated speech according to time and place. Church, the refectory during reading, and the dormitory at night called for particular restraint. Formal business, instruction, confession, hospitality, and work could require words. Some orders embraced much more solitude and silence than others. The goal was discipline, not the disappearance of every human voice. When ordinary conversation was limited, gesture could help with simple needs, though elaborate systems should not be projected onto every house without evidence. A look toward a door, a hand indicating an object, or a familiar movement could be enough. In the chapter house, however, the community could speak within the form of the meeting. The room made language official and therefore accountable. The reading also made the institution remember itself. A monastery might own estates, receive rents, educate novices, host travelers, care for sick members, and interact with bishops, patrons, towns, and rulers. Yet within the chapter house, it returned to the rule that justified its common life. The distance between ideal and practice was not always small. Reading the ideal repeatedly did not prove perfect obedience. It showed that the standard remained present, available for praise, correction, interpretation, and occasional discomfort. Correction could occur here, but it need not be imagined as constant spectacle. The Benedictine rule contains procedures for faults, exclusion, and restoration, reflecting the serious concern placed upon communal order. Actual discipline varied, and records tend to preserve trouble more readily than uneventful obedience. Our morning meeting contains only a modest matter. A brother neglected an assigned item and acknowledges it. The response is measured. There is no need for thunder, chains, or melodrama. A community can be corrected by being required to pay attention. The man stands briefly in the open area. He listens. The issue is stated, the expectation clarified, and the meeting moves on. Perhaps he feels embarrassed. Perhaps he has heard a similar reminder before. The stone floor offers no opinion. The daylight has advanced by the width of a hand. The dead could also remain part of the chapter house's memory. Communities kept records of benefactors and members whose anniversaries were observed. Names connected the living institution to people who had given land, labor, books, vessels, or years of service. How remembrance was performed varied, but the effect was to make the meeting room a place where time accumulated. Today's task sat beside yesterday's gift and tomorrow's obligation. A name is read. Some brothers knew the person. Younger members know only the sound and the place assigned in memory. The name settles among them without requiring a dramatic biography. Medieval institutions endured partly through such repeated acts, quiet enough to seem minor and persistent enough to outlast individual voices. The chapter meeting continues with assignments. The rule balanced communal prayer, reading, and manual work, but a house's real needs changed with the season. Harvest could demand urgency. Winter maintenance differed from summer labor. A feast altered the pattern. Illness removed a person from his normal task. A guest created work for the kitchen and guest facilities. The abbot and officers had to fit a stable ideal around unstable circumstances. One brother will assist near the stores. Another will read at the meal. A younger member will accompany an elder. A skilled hand is directed toward a repair. Not all work within a monastery was performed by choir monks. Servants, hired laborers, tenants, craftspeople, and, in some Cistercian contexts, lay brothers formed parts of a much larger economic and social world. The chapter house ordered the life of the religious community, but the monastery's activity extended well beyond those seated along its walls. The reader for the meal has his own small preparation. Reading aloud while others eat is a service, and the rule treated it as a weekly assignment rather than an opportunity claimed casually by anyone feeling eloquent. The reader needed sufficient skill and a steady pace. He would eat separately or receive food in a way that allowed him to complete the duty. For now, he notes the assigned text and perhaps feels the slight concern familiar to anyone who must pronounce difficult names before a quiet audience. The meeting does not last all morning. Its value lies in regularity and form. Matters are named, instructions given, the rule heard, and the community placed in relation to its own order. At the close, bodies shift along the wall. Knees straighten. A sleeve is drawn away from a damp patch of stone. The book is closed carefully. When the brothers return to the cloister walk, the open court has brightened. Dew still remains in shadow, but the sun has reached the upper grass. The architecture resumes its work of distributing people. Some turn toward study or assigned labor. Others continue to another office. The reader carries the day's passage in memory. The abbot remains briefly with an officer to settle one detail that did not require the whole community. The cloister is now less silent than it was immediately after prayer. Necessary words pass in low tones where local custom permits. A tool is carried across one end. A door opens toward a service passage. The regulated life does not look like motionlessness. It looks like movement given routes. For a novice, routes are part of education. He learns where to stand, when to walk, which door is used at night, where water is drawn, and how to avoid arriving at the refectory by the least appropriate entrance. The rule may be read aloud in chapters, but much daily knowledge enters through imitation. He watches the elder ahead of him. When others turn, he turns. When they sit, he waits a fraction of a moment and sits. The novice's uncertainty is not necessarily dramatic. It consists of tiny delays. He reaches for a door after someone else has already opened it. He brings an object and then discovers that it belongs on the opposite side of the room. The community absorbs these errors as long as learning continues. Years later, he may become the elder whose movements another novice follows through the same arch. The cloister also changes with weather. Rain drums on the roof and darkens the outer edge of paving. Snow makes the central court seem brighter and more distant. Summer brings warmth, insects, and the smell of plants. On a windy day, leaves gather in corners despite the enclosure's geometry. Architecture offers shelter, not complete separation from the world. The walk beside the church may be used for reading in suitable light, depending on custom and place. A seated figure bends over a page while footsteps pass. Books require care, and the available brightness shifts across the hours. Another brother repeats words softly enough not to disturb others. Learning is not confined to a room labeled for scholarship. It fits itself into the spaces the house can provide. Across the open court, the chapter house doorway remains visible. Its meeting has finished, but the room is not empty of purpose. Later generations may alter its floor, repair its roof, or abandon it. Centuries after the voices stop, foundations and carved stones will still reveal where the community gathered. Archaeologists and visitors will read circulation from walls, much as the monks once read duty from bells. At Netley, the surviving layout allows modern eyes to trace a Cistercian arrangement of church and ranges. At other sites, ruins preserve less, and imagination must be disciplined by what remains. The temptation is always to furnish every missing room with confidence. A calmer history leaves some doors only partly open. It says that a room likely served a purpose, that a custom is documented in a particular setting, and that medieval life was varied enough to resist one perfect floor plan. Our composite monastery can therefore remain specific in sensation and modest in claim. The paving is cool. The chapter reading is repeated. The abbot listens, decides, and assigns. A novice learns by watching. These details make a plausible morning without pretending that every monk from Ireland to Italy crossed an identical court. The court also teaches the community to live with repetition that is never perfectly repeated. The same corner is turned each day, but the light arrives at a new angle. The same rule is read, but a sentence falls upon a different concern. The same offices gather the same voices, while one voice grows older and another joins as a novice. Regular life is not still life. It changes gradually beneath a dependable shape. Maintenance makes that gradual change visible. Lime wash must be renewed. Roofs need repair. Drains need clearing. Frost opens small weaknesses in mortar, and rain patiently explores them. A prosperous patron may pay for an improvement, while a poorer year requires a patch that is useful but not elegant. The cloister seen by one generation may not be precisely the cloister remembered by the next. Even orderly architecture lives by adjustment. At a doorway, a brother pauses to remove a bit of mud carried in from another yard. The act is minor, almost beneath notice, yet it belongs to governance as surely as the abbot's decision. Shared space depends on hundreds of such corrections. A latch is closed. A lamp is trimmed. A bench is moved back against the wall. Most of the monastery's order is produced without a speech. The chapter house gives formal shape to collective memory, but the cloister carries informal memory in worn material. One can imagine an elder touching a groove in the stone that had been there when he was young. He may not know who first made it. He only knows that countless feet have passed, each attending to a day that felt immediate and then became part of the building. Another bell or signal marks the next portion of the day. Its sound reaches the cloister more clearly now that everyone is awake. The community separates and gathers according to the established rhythm. Some work will happen before food, and meal times themselves will change with season and observance. Hunger is present, but it is expected to wait within the schedule. Near the refectory, preparations have already begun. Bread has been counted. Vessels are set in order. Water is available for washing. In the kitchen area, heat gathers around a pot, and a wooden spoon travels through a patient mixture whose exact ingredients depend on the season, stores, and resources of the house. The morning's abstract instructions become the material facts of portions and places. The chapter house has offered rules in words. The refectory will offer rules in bread, drink, listening, and appetite. Between them lies only a short walk, though the subjects feel different. One considers governance. The other considers how a community eats without allowing the meal to become disorder. The brothers continue along the covered passage. Sunlight now reaches across the court and warms one strip of stone. The shadows of arches lie beside each other in a measured row. A final drop of rainwater falls from the roof, strikes the paving, and disappears into the darkened surface. There is no need to hurry beyond the corner. The book in the chapter house is closed. The day's assignments have been given, and the cloister holds the fading sound of footsteps. Let the morning remain there for a while, enclosed by stone, grass, and the gentle repetition of an ordinary rule. The refectory waits on another side of the cloister, close enough to the church and chapter house to belong to the same daily circuit, yet filled with a different kind of expectation. Prayer and governance have occupied the morning. Now the community approaches bread, cooked food, drink, and the disciplined management of appetite. The subject is ordinary, which is one reason it deserves an unhurried amount of attention. Before entering, the brothers wash. The exact form of the water supply depends upon the site, its date, its engineering, and its resources. Some cloisters had arrangements that brought water near the refectory entrance. Elsewhere, simpler vessels and basins could serve. Whatever the setting, the movement from work or passage to a common meal encouraged practical cleanliness. Water touches cold hands, runs along fingers, and disappears into stone or a waiting container. The line moves indoors. A medieval monastic refectory was not one universal room repeated without change, though surviving examples make its purpose legible. At Cleve Abbey, a remarkable refectory still allows visitors to stand within a space once associated with communal meals and spiritual reading. Other houses preserve foundations, fragments, or altered walls. Our reconstructed room borrows the long tables, benches, raised reading place, and careful order suggested by rule and surviving architecture, while leaving decorative details to the particular house. Daylight enters from windows high enough to protect the wall space used by tables. The room is brighter than the church at night and cooler than the kitchen nearby. Timber overhead has darkened with age and smoke. Plaster carries patches of color, though not every surface is richly painted. The tables are substantial rather than refined, made to endure elbows, bowls, knives, spilled liquid, and repeated cleaning. Places are known. Seniority, office, local custom, and community structure can affect the arrangement. The brothers sit without the scrape and chatter of a busy inn. Clothing settles. A bowl touches wood. Someone adjusts a bench by the width of a hand, making a small sound that seems larger because conversation is restrained. Regulated silence at the meal did not mean that food arrived in a world without language. It meant that one voice was given special room. The rule of Saint Benedict assigned a weekly reader, a brother who read while the others ate. The task was service, not entertainment, and not a casual turn taken by whoever had recently discovered confidence. The reader was to receive a blessing and be supported so that hunger did not make the duty unnecessarily difficult. Our reader climbs to the appointed place with a book already prepared. He has looked over the passage and identified the words most likely to resist him. A narrow window gives light. He sets the volume down, finds the line, waits until the room is ready, and begins. His voice does not need to rise greatly. The architecture and the silence help carry it. A phrase travels across the first table, then the second. The listeners receive words while their hands perform familiar movements. Bread is divided. A spoon enters a bowl. Drink is poured with care. The meal becomes a period of hearing as well as eating. The Benedictine rule supplied concrete guidance about food, but its provisions should not be mistaken for a complete menu preserved unchanged across the medieval world. It described a baseline of 2 cooked dishes so that different needs might be met. If fruit or fresh vegetables were available, another item could be added. It also discussed an allowance of bread and adjustments according to the number and timing of meals. Such prescriptions reveal an ideal of sufficiency, restraint, and practical accommodation rather than a promise that every table always looked the same. Our bowls might hold a modest pottage, though the ingredients are stated cautiously. Grain, legumes, garden plants, onions, herbs, or other local produce could enter cooked dishes depending on season, stores, region, and household wealth. The food of an English abbey in one century was not identical to that of an Italian house in another. Even within one foundation, an abundant summer and a difficult late winter offered very different choices. The bread is easier to imagine broadly, though its grain, color, texture, and quality could vary. A loaf is not the soft, square object of a modern shelf. It has a firm crust and an irregular shape. A brother breaks his portion and catches the crumbs in his palm. Another softens a piece in the liquid from his bowl. The reader continues steadily, and chewing becomes part of the room's quiet rhythm. Modern summaries sometimes turn monastic diet into a simple declaration that all monks were vegetarians. The rule is more specific and more complicated. It restricted the flesh of four-footed animals for healthy members, while making allowance for those who were very weak or sick. This did not create a single modern vegetarian diet. Fish, eggs, dairy foods, local interpretation, reform movements, wealth, fasting seasons, health, and regional custom all complicate the picture. Practice could also drift away from an ideal. The meal of a choir monk might differ from that of a sick resident in the infirmary, a guest, a servant, a hired worker, or a laborer outside the enclosure. A large monastery contained distinctions of role and status, as well as a language of common life. The rules provisions focused on the religious community, while the kitchens might serve several groups under different expectations. To imagine one equal bowl traveling unchanged to every person would be as misleading as imagining one timetable for every order. Today, our healthy brothers receive the ordinary food appointed for them. An older man is given something suited to his condition. The adjustment is quiet and carries no shame. Care for weakness belonged within the rule, which repeatedly tempered discipline with attention to age, illness, labor, and need. A rigid table that ignored a sick body would fail the community's own stated purpose. The reader reaches the end of a paragraph. He pauses only long enough to breathe and locate the next line. No one applauds. The service is working precisely because it draws little attention to itself. He may be reading scripture, a religious commentary, a saint's life, or another approved text, according to the time and custom. The exact book in our scene remains unnamed, allowing the practice to remain firmer than the decoration. Meal timing changed through the year, and according to days of fasting or celebration. The rule linked the schedule to seasons and observance rather than imposing one modern lunch hour. On some days, the community ate later. At other times, 2 meals could be provided. Work demands, especially in periods of agricultural pressure, also required judgment. Appetite therefore learned to listen to the calendar as well as the stomach. Waiting could be a form of discipline, though medieval bodies were no less aware of hunger than modern ones. A brother who had risen in the dark and stood through offices could feel the arrival of food with considerable clarity. The smell from the bowl, the weight of bread, and the first warm mouthful were not abstract spiritual symbols. They were relief. The rule did not erase this pleasure. It tried to keep pleasure from becoming possession and disorder. Drink requires equal caution because a persistent modern story claims that medieval people avoided water and drank ale or beer because water was always unsafe. That sweeping claim is false. People drank water where suitable sources were available, and medieval communities paid attention to springs, wells, conduits, rivers, and storage. Ale, beer, and wine also belonged to medieval diets in different regions and circumstances. The rule discussed a measure of wine while acknowledging that abstinence was preferable and local conditions could affect supply. None of this turns drink into a universal substitute for water. In our room, a vessel is passed. The liquid is poured without ceremony. The amount is sufficient rather than lavish. A drop lands on the table and is wiped away with a cloth. The reader's voice crosses the brief sound. No brother launches into a debate about sanitation, which is fortunate for the peaceful direction of the meal. Behind the refectory lies the labor that made this quiet possible. Grain had to be grown, received, stored, inspected, milled, and baked. Vegetables needed planting and gathering. Fuel had to reach the kitchen. Water had to be carried or channeled. Pots required cleaning. Accounts needed keeping. Some of this work was performed by members of the community, some by servants, estate workers, tenants, specialists, or lay brothers in contexts where that role was important. The kitchen was not a stage on which every monk cheerfully stirred the same pot. It was a working area with heat, sharp implements, smoke, heavy vessels, wet floors, and a hierarchy of responsibility. The rule assigned weekly kitchen service among capable members, while allowing exemptions for sickness or important duties. Service rotated because feeding the community was necessary work, closely joined to the discipline of common life. A kitchen brother has been awake long enough to know exactly which fire draws well and which one will smoke when the wind turns. He checks the pot by habit. Another carries bread from storage. A servant moves a container whose weight requires both arms. Their morning is measured in fuel and readiness. By the time the seated community hears the first line of reading, much practical labor has already disappeared into the apparent simplicity of a bowl. The rules to cook dishes were intended partly to allow for differing needs. If a person could not eat one, the other might be suitable. This practical flexibility sits comfortably beside the wider ideal of restraint. Monastic discipline was not simply the smallest possible quantity of food. It was an effort to remove private excess, grumbling, competition, and avoidable hardship from a common table. Grumbling received special suspicion because it could turn a small inconvenience into a communal climate. The rule repeatedly warned against it in work and service. One can understand the concern. 6 quiet complaints about bread can occupy more space than one imperfect loaf. Our imagined brothers keep their judgments private, though one may notice that today's pottage is thinner than yesterday's. He takes another spoonful and listens to the reader describe a patience more impressive than his own. Not every historical meal was peaceful. Rules exist partly because disorder was possible. Food could become a source of privilege, resentment, negotiation, generosity, or corruption. Wealthy monasteries could develop more elaborate tables, and reform movements often reacted against perceived softness. Surviving records may reveal exceptions, disputes, or special provisions. A calm reconstruction should not claim flawless observance. It can show the ordinary ideal toward which a house arranged its room. The room also contains sensory details that no regulation can fully standardize. Steam rises from one bowl more visibly than another. A crust breaks loudly. The bench presses against the back of a leg. The reader's page turns with a dry whisper. Light shifts across a vessel, and for a moment the liquid inside holds a small bright rectangle from the window. Vessels themselves tell a quiet story of resources. Wood, pottery, and metal could all appear in a medieval household, but their distribution depended on means, date, region, and purpose. A rich foundation possessed objects that a poorer cell could not easily replace. Even then, the most impressive plate was not necessarily placed before every brother. Common life required durable things, and durability was often more useful than splendor. A bowl develops scratches. A spoon becomes smooth where many fingers have held it. A cup may carry a repair rather than being discarded. These marks do not make the meal picturesque to the people using them. They make the objects familiar. The server knows which vessel sits unevenly and turns it so the table supports it. Such knowledge never appears in a formal rule, yet it is part of what allows the rule to operate. Temperature also divides the diners in small ways. The brother nearest a draft feels the food cool quickly. A place nearer an interior wall remains gentler. In winter, warm pottage offers comfort before it offers theological meaning. In summer, the same thick dish may inspire quieter enthusiasm. Seasonal regulation could alter timing and portions, but it could not persuade whether to become equally pleasant in every seat. An allowance for the sick reminds the healthy that bodies do not obey identical measures. Tooth pain can make hard bread difficult. Fever can remove appetite. Age can slow a hand. The infirmary and its care belong later in our day, but their existence is already present at the table whenever a portion is softened, changed, or carried elsewhere. A rule of common life survives not by denying difference, but by deciding how difference can be tended without turning every preference into privilege. The same judgment applies to heavy labor. A person assigned to demanding work may need more than one who has remained seated, and the rule allowed superiors to make adjustments. This was not modern nutritional science written in monastic language. It was practical recognition that effort consumed strength. The challenge was to answer need without creating a private contest over who had worked hardest. Eating without casual conversation changes the experience of time. Each sound is distinct. Spoons do not form a constant clatter because movements are measured. The reading gives the meal a pace beyond appetite. A brother may finish early and remain still. Another eats slowly, careful not to keep the service waiting. The community begins together and ends within an established order. Signals could be used for necessary communication when speech was limited, depending upon local custom. A gesture might request an item or draw a server's attention. It would be unsafe to invent one complete sign language for every monastery, but the practical need is easy to understand. Silence did not abolish communication. It narrowed it and made each movement more deliberate. At the raised place, the reader feels his throat drying. He continues, "His meal will be provided outside the immediate duty, according to the arrangement of the house." The assignment protects the others listening, but should not punish the reader with needless hunger. The rule's concern for this detail is characteristic. Great ideals often appear beside instructions about portions, turns, utensils, and fatigue. The meal approaches its close. The last section is read. Bowls contain only traces. Breadcrumbs are gathered rather than treated as meaningless. The community offers thanks. The reader closes the book, keeping a hand beneath the cover so it does not fall heavily. Benches shift. The brothers rise. Tables and vessels must be cleared, and the assigned servers remain attentive. Waste has value in a household where food depends on land, labor, and uncertain weather. Leftovers may be managed according to custom, need, and charity, but the exact route differs. Nothing in our scene needs to vanish simply because the narrative has finished eating. The weekly servers wash vessels and restore order. Water clouds is changed and runs over wood or pottery. A cloth moves across the table. Crumbs cling to a damp patch, then collect under the server's hand. The room slowly returns to its waiting state. At the next appointed meal, the same places will fill again, though the reading and food may change. Care for utensils received explicit attention in the Benedictine tradition. The material goods of the monastery were not to be handled as if common ownership made them valueless. An officer responsible for stores and tools carried a serious duty, and those using kitchen items were expected to return them. A missing ladle could be a small spiritual problem and a very immediate kitchen problem at the same time. Outside, the cloister has warmed. The smell of cooked food follows briefly through the doorway and then thins in open air. Some brothers will go toward manual tasks. Others will read, study, administer property, care for the sick, or prepare for another office. The division is never as clean as a modern chart. Prayer, work, and reading interrupt and support one another through the day. Fasting days and lean seasons remind us that the comfortable completeness of our meal was not guaranteed. Harvest failure, war, local damage, debt, or poor management could narrow supplies. Conversely, wealthy foundations might possess resources far beyond the modest image encouraged by reforming ideals. Medieval monastic tables existed between prescription and circumstance. The rules stated what should guide them, while land, weather, patronage, and human appetite influenced what appeared. For the brothers stepping back into the light, the meal settles quietly. There is no lingering coffee, no menu to consider, and no conversation about the best dish. He has received his portion and the reader's words together. One nourished the body directly. The other was intended to keep the mind from wandering entirely toward the bowl. The reading itself may remain only partly in memory. A phrase follows him around the cloister, mixed with the sound of the spoon and the bright edge of the window. That is enough. Monastic formation depended on return. Another text would be heard, another section of the rule read, another meal eaten under a voice. No single morning had to carry the whole weight of understanding. Near the kitchen, the fire is reduced to the level needed for the next task. A pot cools. The workers take their own food according to the house's arrangements. A door stands open long enough to release heat, then closes. The refectory becomes still except for the final movement of a cloth across wood. There is no hurry to reach the fields or workshops. The quiet room can remain in the mind for a little longer. Bread has been broken, portions received, and a measured voice has traveled over the tables. Beyond the wall, tools wait in the growing daylight, while the last curl of steam thins and disappears. There is no hurry at all as the meal recedes into memory and the community returns to the measured business of the day. The reader's voice has fallen silent. Wooden bowls have been gathered. A door closes without a slam, and the last footfalls leave the refectory for the covered walk. Outside, the light has strengthened, though it remains softened by cloud and old glass. The stones of the cloister hold a little of the morning chill. The garden beyond them waits with the patient appearance of a place that has been worked many times before. In a community shaped by the rule of Saint Benedict, prayer did not replace ordinary work. The rule gave time to both manual labor and sacred reading, arranging them differently according to the season. Its language treated necessary work as part of the discipline of common life. It did not describe labor as an unfortunate pause between more elevated moments. Bread still had to be prepared, clothing repaired, rooms swept, lamps tended, and stores watched. The life of devotion remained attached to wood, wool, water, earth, and accounts. The schedule could bend when necessity pressed upon it. Harvest was an obvious example. Crops did not wait for a convenient blank space between offices, and the rule acknowledged that members of a community might have to gather the harvest themselves. This did not mean that every monk in every house spent every summer cutting grain. It meant that the ideal timetable had room for the plain fact that weather, ripeness, and hunger set deadlines of their own. Our composite community now separates into smaller groups, though the arrangement is a calm reconstruction rather than the record of one particular house. One person carries a basket toward the garden. Another checks folded cloth in a workroom. A third takes a wax tablet or a scrap of parchment toward a table where quantities will be noted. Somewhere near the kitchen, water is poured and a rough surface is scrubbed. None of these motions makes much sound beyond the scrape of wood, the brush of cloth, and the quiet setting down of a tool. The garden is not a romantic wilderness. Its beds need edges, paths need clearing, and plants require attention that is often repetitive. A gardener bends, loosens earth, removes what is unwanted, and moves on by the length of a hand. The precise plants would depend upon place, climate, wealth, and purpose, so there is no need to fill every bed with a universal medieval list. It is enough to notice the ordered ground, the damp soil, and the slow progression along a row. In another season, the same ground might be hard, dusty, or hidden beneath frost. Medieval schedules followed daylight more closely than a modern wall clock suggests, and the balance of reading and labor changed across the year. A long summer day permitted a different arrangement from a short winter one. The bells and offices kept their recurring sequence, but the spaces between them could expand or contract. The work settled into those spaces as water settles into the shape of a vessel. Some tasks were performed near the enclosure, where the movement from church to workroom was brief. Others belonged to a much larger economic landscape. Monastic communities could control estates, receive rents, manage mills and pastures, and negotiate the many obligations that came with land. Their scale differed greatly. A modest house in a wealthy abbey did not possess the same reach, the same number of dependents, or the same rooms full of records. It is useful to pause over that difference, because the quiet image of a few monks doing everything for themselves is too simple. Large estates depended on many people who were not choir monks. Servants, hired laborers, tenants, craftspeople, carters, shepherds, cooks, and local officials might all enter the wider story. Some worked near the central buildings. Others lived at a distance and encountered the monastery through rent, employment, trade, charity, or authority. The work of one institution could therefore be spread across fields and settlements far beyond the cloister wall. A sack delivered at the gate carried with it the labor of hands the monastery did not house. A note in an account might represent days of walking, cutting, loading, and waiting. The cloister could feel enclosed, yet the community was not sealed away from the economy around it. Its meals, repairs, candles, clothing, and hospitality depended upon a web of relationships. Within certain Cistercian settings, lay brothers formed a particularly important part of that web. They belonged to the religious household, but followed a pattern distinct from the choir monks, and they often carried major responsibilities in agricultural and practical work. Their role changed over time and cannot be copied onto every order or every century. Still, their presence helps correct the tidy picture in which every person inside a monastery lived precisely the same day. At a large Cistercian abbey such as Revo, surviving structures and the shape of the precinct hint at a community supported by complicated arrangements of service and labor. The ruins now appear tranquil, but their occupied spaces would have required constant maintenance. Roofs weathered, drains needed attention, doors warped, cloth wore thin, food arrived in uneven quantities. The silence of stone in the present can conceal the administrative and physical effort that once held the place together. The rule's balance of reading and work also warns us against separating the life of the mind from the life of the hands too sharply. Reading itself required labor. A book had to be obtained, protected, carried, and sometimes copied. A reader needed enough light and enough time. A text might be heard in company rather than studied alone. Attention was a form of work, particularly when the same sacred words returned across months and years. In our imagined afternoon, one member sits under a cloister walk with a book resting carefully before him. This is not a claim that every monastery possessed a grand library, or that each monk spent hours among luxury manuscripts. Books were costly, levels of learning differed, and collections varied. The scene simply follows the rule's provision of time for reading. The page is held steady. The eye moves line by line. Wind touches the edge and is stopped by a patient hand. Nearby, a practical list is being checked. Administration may lack the polished glow that later pictures give to monastic life, but it belonged to the ordinary burden of property and community. Grain in a storehouse, cloth in a chest, a broken hinge, a payment due, or an animal sent from an outlying holding could all require memory made durable. Some records survive because institutions needed to remember what was owed, granted, spent, or received. The person keeping such a record was not floating above the material world. Ink had to be prepared or purchased. The writing surface had value. A mistake could not be removed by pressing a key. Letters formed slowly, interrupted by the need to compare amounts or ask for information. The finished line might be plain and functional. It did not need illumination or gold to shape the life of an estate. Elsewhere, cloth passes through several hands. A worn edge is examined. Thread is drawn through fabric. A garment belonging to common life is repaired because replacement carries a cost. The rule contained instructions about clothing and distribution, though local materials and climates produced variety. A community in a colder region faced needs unlike those of a warmer one. The general principle of provision had to become specific through wool, leather, linen, and whatever was actually available. Kitchen work continues beyond the formal meal. Vessels must be cleaned, fuel managed, leftovers considered, and the next service prepared. The weekly assignment of kitchen duties described in the rule made service part of the shared pattern, even though large houses could also rely on servants and specialized workers. The arrangement in any real monastery depended on its size, wealth, order, and period. A rule offered a frame. Daily life filled the frame unevenly. In a workshop, the sound changes. A wooden surface receives a measured tap. A tool is laid down. Metal may need sharpening, a handle tightening, or a small object repairing. We do not need to assign every craft to a monk. Skilled work often belonged to trained people, and monastic households bought services as well as providing some within their own communities. The safer image is one of cooperation, hierarchy, and exchange, not effortless self-sufficiency. That hierarchy should not dissolve into the soft light of our scene. Monasteries were religious communities, but they were also institutions and societies marked by rank and unequal power. An abbot or prior did not stand in the same position as a hired laborer. A tenant might experience monastic landholding as obligation rather than serenity. A guest of high status and a poor traveler could receive different accommodations. Calm narration does not require pretending that everyone shared authority or comfort, nor does it require making labor picturesque. Repetition could tire the shoulders. Cold water remained cold. Mud clung to footwear. A load was heavier at the end of a long path than at the beginning. The rule's language of discipline acknowledged effort by organizing it, not by making it disappear. Necessary work could be spiritually meaningful and physically wearing at the same time. The midday light moves across the cloister. A strip of brightness that rested beside one column now touches the next. Such movement is a more faithful clock for this story than a numbered dial. People notice when the sun reaches a familiar wall or when a shadow crosses a doorway. Then the bell sounds again, and unfinished work is placed in a condition that can wait. The tool is wiped and set down. The book is closed. Loose material is covered. Hands are brushed against an apron or washed if water is near. The community regathers from its separate tasks, though not every worker on the estate can be present. The office draws the choir together, while fields and kitchens retain their own obligations. Common rhythm and practical exception exist beside one another. After prayer, work may resume. The sequence is not dramatic. The same path is walked again. The basket is lifted from where it rested. A line of writing receives another entry. A younger member follows an older one and learns by watching where things belong. Much of institutional knowledge lives in such small repetitions, in the position of a key, the proper storage of a tool, and the remembered order of a task. Training did not always take the form of a formal lesson. A novice might learn that damp cloth must not be folded away, that a particular door sticks in wet weather, or that silence in one area is observed more strictly than in another. A lay worker might know the land more intimately than a person who governed it. Expertise could be practical, local, and largely absent from the written sources that survive. This absence asks for modesty. Records often preserve ideals, property, disputes, gifts, rules, and exceptional events more readily than the exact texture of an unremarkable afternoon. We can say that manual labor and reading were formally balanced in Benedictine tradition. We can say that estates required many kinds of work. The color of one worker's sleeve or the words spoken beside one gate remain reconstruction. So the story stays close to what ordinary materials permit. Earth darkens beneath water. A wooden handle becomes smooth where generations of palms hold it. Wool catches on rough skin. Dust gathers in an unused corner. A page receives light from one side. These details do not claim to reproduce one dated afternoon. They offer a gentle route through the kinds of attention that made communal life possible. The monastery's economy also included giving. Rules and customs placed value on care for guests, the sick, and the poor, though resources and practice varied. Food set aside for others had to come from stores already measured. A gate opened for a traveler required a porter. Charity was not an airy idea separated from labor. It was bread baked, bedding aired, water carried, and time diverted from another task. When supplies were plentiful, that diversion may have been easier. In lean years, decisions became harder. A poor harvest, local disorder, damage, or debt could narrow what a house offered. Wealthy institutions could possess impressive resources while still facing uneven management and competing claims. Smaller communities might live much closer to shortage. There was no single monastic standard of comfort. Even within one house, age and health altered the day. The strongest person could carry what another could not. Someone unwell might be excused from a task. An older member could contribute through memory, counsel, prayer, or lighter work. The rule repeatedly allowed adjustment for weakness, reminding us that common discipline was not simply identical treatment. The body entered the schedule with all its variations. The community's physical arrangement reflected these distinctions imperfectly. Some doors led toward areas of service, others toward sacred or communal rooms. At particular monasteries, separate ranges accommodated groups whose days overlapped without matching. Architecture could guide movement and express hierarchy. Yet buildings were altered, rebuilt, repurposed, and sometimes never completed as first intended. It is tempting to look at a ground plan and imagine a machine working with perfect regularity. Real occupation was less exact. Rain entered. Smoke drifted. A visitor arrived at an inconvenient moment. A tool went missing. Someone misunderstood an instruction. A harvest demanded longer hours. Bells offered a framework of recurrence, but human communities lived inside it with ordinary adjustments. The working hours also tied the monastery to seasonal sound. In 1 month, the air beyond the wall might hold birds and the distant movement of animals. In another, wind presses against shutters and leaves only indoor noises, the scrape of a bench, the crackle of a small fire, the careful turning of a page. The rule shifted its allocations of reading and labor because the year itself shifted. Winter work could move toward repair, storage, study, and whatever the house needed indoors, though no single list fits every site. Summer stretched the practical day outward. Harvest overrode neat divisions when it had to. The recurring offices continued to gather time into recognizable portions. Between them, the community met the season as it arrived rather than as an ideal calendar imagined it. Closer to the cloister, another task is ending. Soil is pressed gently around a plant. A basket that was full of weeds or cuttings is carried away. The path is cleared of what would make tomorrow's steps awkward. There is satisfaction in the modest completeness of a bed finished from one marker to the next. There is also the knowledge that growth will continue and the work will return. That returning work suits the long rhythm of monastic life. It is not a project completed once and displayed forever. Cloth will wear again. Dust will settle again. Accounts will require another line. Fuel will be consumed, meals prepared, doors opened, and gardens altered by weather. Repetition can sound dull, yet dullness is part of stability. The house persists because ordinary duties are performed more than once. As afternoon begins to soften, the community gradually moves from labor toward another period of prayer and reading. The exact order depends on the local custom and season we are imagining. No modern minute hand governs the transition. A change in light, the completion of an assigned task, and the familiar bell brings separate movements back into relation. The worker in the garden straightens slowly. The person at the table dries the pen and protects the written page. A folded garment returns to its place, stronger at the seam than it was earlier. A kitchen vessel rests upside down. These are small endings rather than grand achievements, and they are enough for one interval of the day. Behind them, the wider estate continues. Not everyone stops when the choir gathers. A cart still has distance to travel. An animal still requires tending. A tenant's household follows its own demands. The monastic office is central to the religious community, but it does not freeze the surrounding world. The bell crosses a landscape filled with many schedules. For a few moments, however, the sound makes those schedules briefly audible to one another. It reaches the covered walk, the workroom, the garden, perhaps the road beyond. Some turn toward church. Others recognize the hour and continue. The air holds the note until stone, earth, wood, and distance absorb it. There is no need to follow every hand to its next duty. The useful thing to carry forward is the quiet weight of maintenance. Medieval monastic life depended on rules, prayer, and reading, but also on repaired cloth, managed stores, cultivated ground, recorded obligations, and the work of many people whose names rarely appear. The cloister receives the returning footfalls. Light lies lower now, warm on one wall and cool on another. Tools rest where they can be found again. The garden releases the smell of damp earth. Beyond the enclosure, labor continues beneath the same broad sky, while within it the community gathers once more into its measured cadence. Nothing has been invented in this afternoon except our gentle arrangement of its details. The old rule provided time for reading and work. Surviving places preserve the shapes through which people moved. Records hint at estates, obligations, service, and care. Between those firm edges, the imagined dust settles quietly. The page closes, and tired hands become still. The day does not rush toward its ending. It merely leans a little farther west. Shadows lengthen over the garden paths. A last thread of light rests on the worn handle of a tool, then slips away. The bell's echo fades, and the monastery breathes at the slow pace of work set down until it is needed again. There is no hurry as the working interval gives way to a quieter kind of attention. The garden tools have been returned, the account page covered, and the repaired cloth folded. Afternoon light enters the cloister at a lower angle, finding the softened edge of each column and leaving the walk between them cool. From here, 3 paths can be followed without haste. One leads toward a book, one toward the infirmary, and one toward the monastery door. These paths do not meet in every medieval house exactly as they do in our story. Buildings differed, resources differed, and customs changed across orders and centuries. They are brought together because each reveals a form of care. A reader cares for words. An infirmary cares for a body that cannot keep the common pace. A porter cares for the boundary between an enclosed community and the road beyond it. The first path ends at a table where a manuscript rests. It need not stand in a magnificent room devoted only to copying. The familiar picture of every monastery possessing a busy scriptorium, with rows of monks producing splendid books, is too universal. Manuscript work happened in some communities and in different spaces. Collections varied, and many houses never supported the sort of large production associated with famous centers. What matters here is simpler. The rule of Saint Benedict allotted periods for reading, and books were essential to the repeated life of prayer and instruction. A text could be read aloud in church, in the refectory, or in a gathering. It could also be studied with slower private attention. Even a modest collection required protection from damp, rough handling, loss, and fire. Our reader sits where the light is useful. The page is not white in the modern sense. Its surface holds slight variations, and the writing rests upon it with the quiet authority of something made by hand. The reader supports the book carefully. A finger may follow the line, not from ignorance, but because attention is easier when the body helps the eye remain in place. The words arrive at the pace of the page. There is no scrolling and no sudden abundance. One section is read, considered, and perhaps read again. The book may be borrowed for an appointed period under local arrangements, and it must return. In Benedictine tradition, the discipline of reading was not simply leisure. It occupied time that the daily order deliberately protected. If the book is being copied, the work becomes slower still. A line is measured, letters are formed, and mistakes demand patience. Yet we should keep the claim bounded. Not every manuscript was copied by a monk. Not every monk was a scribe, and monastic houses did not preserve all ancient learning by themselves. Secular workshops, cathedral communities, courts, universities, private patrons, and many other institutions belong to the history of books. Some monasteries nevertheless created, owned, commissioned, exchanged, and preserved manuscripts of lasting importance. Their books could serve worship, study, law, administration, or memory. A plain service book might matter more to daily routine than a richly decorated volume. The ordinary manuscript, marked by use, turns many pages in the life of a community even when no visitor pauses to admire it centuries later. The reader's work includes listening. A difficult phrase is mouthed softly or held inwardly. Another person's footsteps pass behind the chair. A bell does not yet sound. Dust in the light moves with no purpose at all. For several minutes, the room contains only the gradual passage from one line to the next. Elsewhere, a person charged with material care checks keys, vessels, tools, and stores. The rule devoted attention to communal property, instructing that objects should be treated with care. Such instruction reminds us how easily things were lost, damaged, or unevenly distributed. A monastery needed spiritual aspiration, but it also needed someone to know where blankets, cups, tools, and provisions had gone. The route now turns toward the infirmary. At Revo Abbey, the remains of an infirmary complex lie east of the monks' dormitory, associated with the care of older or sick members. It was not a modern hospital transplanted into the Middle Ages. Its organization, remedies, knowledge, staffing, and expectations belonged to a different world. Yet it represented a real effort to make room for bodies that could not follow the normal discipline. The rule placed care of the sick at high priority. It also warned that those receiving care should not make unreasonable demands, a reminder that ideals and tensions live together. Illness altered diet, work, sleep, and participation in common offices. The very weak could receive food that healthy members were normally denied. Common life had to bend around the particular needs of a person. In our reconstructed room, an older resident lies under a wool covering. The exact furnishing is not claimed for every site. We notice only a raised place for rest, a vessel within reach, and light filtered through an opening. The air is warmer than the exposed walk, though warmth is never guaranteed. A caretaker enters with measured steps and sets something down. The patient hears the sounds of the community from a slight distance. A door opens. Water is poured. Farther away, feet cross stone. The offices may still shape the day, but illness creates another schedule made of rest, discomfort, food, and brief attention. The familiar bell can comfort, disturb, or simply mark time beyond the bed. Medieval care drew upon inherited medical traditions, local experience, prayer, available foods, herbs, and the judgment of practitioners whose learning varied. We do not need to claim a particular treatment in this room. To place an exact plan in the cup would require evidence from a more specific setting. The safer detail is the act of offering, the pause while the patient drinks, and the vessel taken away. An infirmary also acknowledged age. A long religious life did not protect the knees from pain or the eyes from dimming. Older members might be given different food, lighter work, or more rest according to need and custom. The rule's adjustments for weakness reveal that discipline was not merely a rigid schedule applied without regard to the body. Resources shaped the quality of care. A wealthy abbey could support spaces and supplies unavailable to a poor house. A small community might rely on fewer attendants. Periods of shortage or disease place strain on every arrangement. The existence of an infirmary did not guarantee comfort or recovery. It did make sickness visible within the institutional plan rather than treating every absence as a failure of will. Near the patient's bed, a reader may quietly repeat a familiar text, or the room may remain still. Either is plausible within the broad world we are describing. We do not need to fill the silence. The caretaker adjusts the covering. Afternoon light moves a little farther across the floor. The patient rests while the larger community continues. From the infirmary, the story walks back through the precinct toward the gate. Monastic houses maintained boundaries of many kinds, but those boundaries were crossed by supplies, messages, officials, laborers, pilgrims, relatives, wealthy patrons, poor travelers, and people seeking help. Enclosure regulated contact. It did not erase it. The rule gave the porter a serious role. The person at the door was expected to receive arrivals with gentleness and to respond promptly. A porter needed maturity because the gate brought interruption. Someone might knock during prayer, work, or rest. The question of entrance could not always wait until the monastery found the moment convenient. Our gatehouse is subdued in the late afternoon. Beyond it, a road holds the residue of recent rain. A traveler approaches at a tired pace, carrying the dust and weather of a day outside the walls. The precise identity is left open. The traveler could be moving for devotion, business, family, or necessity. Medieval roads carried many motives at once. The porter hears the arrival and comes to the door. Formal words and gestures differed across place and time, so the scene remains restrained. A greeting is offered. The traveler's circumstances are considered. The gate does not simply swing open for everyone without distinction. Hospitality operated through rules, spaces, status, resources, and the judgment of those responsible. The rule described guests as worthy of reverent reception, with particular attention to the poor and to pilgrims. Yet real houses made distinctions. A powerful visitor could arrive with attendance and expectations that strained the household. A poor stranger might receive plainer accommodation. Separate guest areas, access limits, and available food shaped what welcome meant in practice. Hospitality required work hidden behind the greeting. A bed or place of rest had to be prepared. Water might be carried. Food had to come from a kitchen and stores already serving the resident community. Fuel was consumed. Cloth needed cleaning afterward. The porter opened the first door, but many hands sustained the welcome. The traveler is guided inward only as far as custom allows. The cloistered areas are not treated as a public inn. A guest space preserves both reception and separation. From there, the visitor may hear a bell, smell food, and sense the rhythm of the house without entering every room. The monastery can be generous and guarded at the same time. Another arrival might be a messenger who stays only long enough to deliver a folded or sealed communication. Another might bring goods. Another might ask for alms. The gate concentrates the outside world into brief encounters. News passes in. Instructions and payments pass out. The porter becomes a listener to roads without needing to travel them. The poor at the door are especially easy to turn into a sentimental image, so our account remains modest. Monastic institutions gave charity in various forms, but practice depended on wealth, season, local expectation, and administration. Giving could be genuine and structured, generous and unequal. It did not remove poverty from the world around the precinct. The gate also had a practical need for caution. Property, enclosure, and safety mattered. Not every request could be granted. Not every visitor was admitted to the same degree. The ideal of welcome had to be translated by a person standing before a real door, with finite bread, finite beds, and duties already in motion. As the porter speaks with the traveler, the manuscript reader reaches the end of a passage. The patient in the infirmary shifts beneath the covering. These 3 moments are not synchronized by a surviving record. Our story aligns them gently to show how different kinds of attention could inhabit the same institution. The reader protects fragile words. The caretaker protects a weakened body. The porter protects both welcome and boundary. Their actions depend on rules, but rules alone do not lift a cup, turn a page, or decide where a wet traveler should sleep. Daily judgment gives form to the written ideal. This world of religious care included women as well as men. Medieval England contained communities of nuns whose daily patterns also included prayer, devotional reading, manual work, common meals, and communal sleeping arrangements, though institutions varied. Some were wealthy and influential. Others were small or poorly provided. Their history does not fit into a single miniature of a male monastery. In a women's house, the same broad themes of book, infirmity, work, hospitality, and governance could appear through different local circumstances. Nuns lived within religious rules and social structures that shaped their access to property, clergy, education, patrons, and family networks. A bounded parallel is more honest than assuming that every arrangement was either identical or entirely separate. We can imagine, cautiously, another reader under another covered walk, a woman attending to a devotional text as afternoon fades. The page receives the same slow light. Yet the reconstruction does not claim a universal costume, room, or task. It simply makes space in the picture for the women whose religious houses belonged to medieval monastic life. Many women's communities maintained communal dormitories and refectories, and their days were structured by offices and practical duties. Their surviving evidence is uneven, as it is for male houses. Buildings have vanished, records favor some institutions over others, and later changes can obscure earlier arrangements. The gaps call for careful language rather than silence. Care within these houses could also extend through education, patronage, prayer, support for dependents, and hospitality, depending on local resources and custom. It would be too easy to assign every nun the same work or to describe all convents as peaceful retreats. They were communities of people, property, discipline, relationships, and differing fortunes. Returning to our composite Benedictine house, the book is now closed for the interval. A cloth may be placed over it, or it may be returned to storage according to local practice. The reader does not own the page in the modern private sense. The text belongs to a pattern of common use, received today and made available again. In the infirmary, the caretaker checks the room once more. Perhaps the patient sleeps. Perhaps wakefulness continues without event. The story does not require recovery before nightfall. Care often consists of remaining present when a problem cannot be solved quickly. The vessel is rinsed. The covering lies evenly. Footsteps withdraw. At the gate, the traveler's needs have found some answer. A place may be offered, a portion provided, a message accepted, or directions given onward. We leave the precise decision unstated because hospitality was not automatic or uniform. The porter closes the outer door with a firm but unhurried movement and returns the key to its place. The three forms of attention settle into the building. A manuscript rests in dimmer light. An older body rests apart from the common dormitory. A guest rests on the safe side of a boundary that remains real. None of these scenes is grand, but each shows a community adjusting its order to something vulnerable. Books were vulnerable to damp, fire, insects, neglect, and loss. Bodies were vulnerable to age and illness. Travelers were vulnerable to weather, hunger, and distance. Institutions could fail all three, and sometimes did. The rules preserved an aspiration to care, while surviving structures and collections show some of the ways that aspiration became material. The contrast is worth keeping. A rule is neither a photograph nor proof of perfect behavior. It tells us what a tradition valued, what problems it anticipated, and what conduct it tried to shape. The infirmary remains at Revo tell us that care occupied space. A surviving manuscript tells us that one object endured. Neither can reproduce every ordinary choice made around them. Care also moved through time rather than only through rooms. A book inherited from an earlier generation could guide a reader who never knew its first owner. An older resident could remember a custom that no one had thought to write down. A porter learned which requests belonged to which official, and a caretaker learned how one patient differed from another. Institutions stored knowledge in objects, records, habits, and people. Each form could fail. A page could be lost, a memory dim, and an instruction be misunderstood. This makes the quiet exchange between generations important without making it flawless. A novice watches how a volume is supported before receiving it. A younger attendant notices where water and cloth are kept. Someone new at the gate observes how an experienced porter balances courtesy with caution. Learning proceeds through repeated, undramatic acts. The community continues not because every answer is written in one rule, but because broad principles are interpreted by people who have performed the work before. When those people become ill or old, care returns to them. The person who once carried books may now need a page read aloud. The person who once opened the gate may listen from a bed as someone else answers it. In that reversal, the house encounters its own dependence. Service is never owned permanently by the strong. It passes from hand to hand as strength changes. Our reconstructed afternoon therefore stays quiet around its uncertainties. We hear the turning page, but do not invent its title. We see a cup, but do not prescribe its contents. We notice a traveler, but do not assign a famous name. These limits leave room for the broad truth of attention without pretending to possess details the record has not kept. Another bell now moves through the air. The reader lifts his head. The porter recognizes the hour. In the infirmary, the patient hears it from bed. Beyond our composite scene, a nun in another house may hear a bell of her own. The sound gathers different lives without making their circumstances identical. Light has nearly left the working surface. The closed book holds its words without effort. The guest settles among unfamiliar walls. The infirmary room grows still. Along the covered walk, footsteps begin to turn toward the evening offices, and the day's scattered acts of care are folded back into common prayer. There is no dramatic reward waiting at the end of the passage. The book remains a book, to be opened again. The sick remain deserving of care even when they do not quickly improve. Tomorrow, the door will receive another knock. The value lies in recurring attention, in the willingness to return to fragile things. The monastery darkens by degrees. A key rests on wood. A vessel dries. A page lies flat beneath its cover. Outside, the road loses its details, and inside, a lamp makes a small circle that asks no more than to be tended. For now, the reader's hands are empty, the caretaker's steps have faded, and the porter sits near the quiet door. The community moves toward evening. The remaining light gathers on stone, grows thin, and disappears without disturbance. Evening has reached the monastery without announcing a single moment as its arrival. The last useful light withdrew from the manuscript. The garden lost the edges of its paths, and the road beyond the gate became a pale line between darker ground. Lamps now make small islands in the larger building. Their flames do not conquer the night. They merely allow a door, a face, or a few written lines to be seen. The community turns toward the final offices of the day. In Benedictine tradition, prayer returned at intervals across daylight and darkness, giving the hours a shape that modern clock numbers only partly capture. Exact timing shifted with season, latitude, local custom, and period. It is safer to follow the sequence than to fasten every bell to a precise minute. Our composite day has already passed through night prayer, dawn, chapter, meal, reading, and work. Now the voices gather again as evening narrows. The church is dim. A lamp catches the edge of a column, then leaves the upper stone in shadow. Fabric settles. A book opens. What follows has been repeated often enough that the community can enter its cadence without excitement. The rule of Saint Benedict placed the offices across the day and gave special attention to what happened after the last one, Compline. Necessary reading was to be completed beforehand, and silence followed. The purpose was not to turn every person into a dramatic figure who never spoke. It was to protect the night's order, to close unnecessary conversation, and to prepare a community for rest in the next summons. The final office is brief in our telling. Psalms and familiar words pass through the church at an even pace. Some voices are strong, others worn by age or the long day. A novice follows carefully. An older member does not need to search for every response. The shared sound rises into the high space and returns softened. No claim is made that observance was perfect. Someone might lose a line, cough, feel impatient, or think of unfinished work. Rules existed partly because attention wandered and communities required correction. The calm ideal and the ordinary mind lived beside one another. Repetition did not remove human distraction. It offered a path back when distraction occurred. When the office ends, the movement outward is subdued. One lamp leads into the cloister walk. The stone beneath each foot is known, yet darkness makes familiar distances feel slightly larger. Conversation is now restricted. At many houses shaped by similar customs, the communal dormitory at night was one of the places where speech was especially limited. This regulated silence must be described carefully. Medieval monks did not all take one universal vow never to speak. Necessary communication continued. Formal business required words, and local rules distinguished places and occasions. Church during worship, the refectory during reading, and the dormitory at night could be guarded spaces of silence. The day outside those settings was not necessarily mute. The distinction matters because a completely silent monastery would have been difficult to operate. Instructions had to be given. Guests had to be received. Accounts had to be discussed. The sick had to express needs. A broken roof did not repair itself through gestures alone. Silence was part of an ordered rhythm, not an erasure of language. After Compline, however, ordinary conversation settles. A person who needs to communicate may use a quiet sign or speak only as custom permits. We do not build a universal dictionary of gestures, because systems differed and evidence belongs to particular communities. It is enough to notice the deliberate reduction of sound. The cloister receives the last footsteps. Doors close gently. A lamp is checked. Somewhere in the infirmary, care continues according to need, since illness does not observe the boundary between office and night. Near the gate, the porter remains responsible for interruption. Great silence can be an aspiration while necessary service continues at its edges. In the dormitory, the beds or sleeping places form a common space according to the Benedictine pattern we have followed. The rule described monks sleeping clothed and ready to rise, with lamps burning until morning and with younger members placed among elders rather than grouped separately. Real buildings and later customs varied, but the instruction reveals a sleep shaped by readiness and supervision. The knight's clothing was practical in the sense of the rule, though we need not reconstruct every garment. A belt is loosened or arranged safely. Footwear is set where it can be found. A blanket is drawn into place. The floor carries a last whisper of movement. Then one body after another becomes still. The lamp remains. Its flame leans when air moves through the room and straightens again. It gives less light than a modern sleeper might expect, yet enough to preserve the instruction that darkness should not be complete. The common dormitory holds breathing, small shifts of cloth, and the faint sounds of a building cooling. Sleep here is not described as universally unbroken or universally divided into two neat portions. The night office interrupted rest in many observant communities, but patterns differed. Season, health, age, labor, local practice, and individual wakefulness all mattered. A rule tells us when people were expected to rise. It cannot tell us exactly how every person slept. One member may fall asleep quickly after the long day. Another may remain awake for a time, listening to wind beyond the wall. An older body may need to change position. A novice may be alert to every unfamiliar sound. These are gentle reconstructions, not facts about named individuals. They remind us that a shared schedule still contained private experiences. Before the next night summons, our story steps away from this dormitory. It travels north through time and landscape to Mount Grace Priory in Yorkshire, where surviving remains and records illuminate a markedly different monastic arrangement. The change is not a correction of the Benedictine scene. It is a counterpoint, showing why one model cannot contain all medieval religious life. Mount Grace was a Carthusian house. Carthusian monks spent much of their time in individual cells arranged around a great cloister. The word cell can mislead a modern listener into imagining only a bare little room. At Mount Grace, each monk's accommodation formed a small set of spaces with access to a private garden, supporting a life of prayer, reading, work, eating, and sleep in greater solitude. The plan changes the sounds of night. Instead of many sleepers sharing one dormitory, doors separate individual lives. The great cloister connects the cells, but it also marks distance. A monk returns to his own enclosure. The quiet is distributed across many small interiors rather than concentrated in one long room. At Mount Grace, meals were generally taken in the cells. Communal meals were associated with Sundays, feast days, and burials. This practice contrasts with the repeated refectory scene of our Benedictine pattern day. It should not be projected onto all monasteries, and it should not turn the Carthusians into people wholly without community. Their solitude existed within a highly organized religious order. A meal could be provided through an arrangement that protected enclosure. The monk received what was needed without turning each delivery into a social visit. The precise sensations we add are modest. A vessel is set down. A hatch or opening closes. Footsteps move away along the cloister. The cell returns to its contained quiet. The individual garden also shaped daily work. Within its walls, a monk could tend the ground as part of a solitary routine. We avoid specifying a universal crop or tool. The important contrast lies in scale and arrangement. Labor that our earlier community performed among shared spaces might here take place within the boundaries of one cell and garden. Solitude did not mean freedom from rule. The Carthusian day was ordered, demanding, and joined to communal worship at appointed times. A monk who lived much of his life apart was still a member of a house, dependent on its buildings, supplies, servants, lay members, governance, and religious purpose. Isolation was structured rather than accidental. At night, the cell holds a different form of attention. A small room, a place for prayer, a place for study or work, and the adjoining garden make a compact world. Wind moves outside the walls. A lamp illuminates a limited surface. The monk's breathing is not surrounded by a full dormitory of others, though the community remains nearby across the cloister. This arrangement could appear more silent than the Benedictine one, but silence itself still requires careful language. Carthusian observance emphasized solitude strongly. Yet even here, necessary systems of provision and worship joined people together. The historical contrast is substantial without needing to become absolute. Mount Grace also reminds us that buildings can preserve arguments about how a religious life should be lived. A communal dormitory expresses one form of order. A ring of individual cells expresses another. Both create routes between prayer, rest, work, and food. Stone, timber, doors, and gardens make a spiritual discipline physical. The people who maintained these arrangements extended beyond the solitary monks. Food reached the cells because someone prepared and carried it. Buildings endured because someone repaired them. The boundary of solitude rested upon a network of service. As in the larger estates described earlier, the most famous resident was never the only worker who made the institution possible. We can imagine, with due caution, a Carthusian monk closing a book as night deepens. The page disappears beneath a cover. The garden beyond the wall is only a dark square. Somewhere across the great cloister, another cell holds a similar lamp, but the monks do not see one another through the stone. The cell is private, though it is not private property in the modern sense. It belongs to a disciplined arrangement in which each monk occupies a place made ready by the institution. Furniture, food, clothing, books, and repairs still depend upon common resources and officials. Solitude therefore rests upon administration. A quiet interior has an unseen account behind it, along with a kitchen, a store, a workshop, and people carrying out necessary service. The garden wall creates another gentle paradox. It permits outdoor labor and changing weather to enter a solitary life while limiting ordinary contact. Rain reaches the soil. Frost marks the season. A bird can cross without permission. The monk works within the boundary, seeing a portion of sky that is both open and enclosed. This image is a reconstruction of atmosphere, but the individual gardens at Mount Grace make the basic arrangement tangible. On a Sunday or feast day, the pattern altered as the community gathered for a meal. The movement from cell to common space reminded each monk that solitude belonged within a body of shared observance. On most other days, eating apart preserved the order's chosen distance. Neither condition was an accident. Gathering and withdrawal were deliberately placed within the week. The burial of a member also brought communal eating into the documented pattern. Death did not turn the house into sudden spectacle. It changed the rhythm through ritual, remembrance, and gathering. A place at the edge of one monk's routine became part of the community's memory. Even an order known for separation needed forms through which absence could be recognized together. We leave the precise ceremony outside this sleep story. What remains is the quiet fact that solitude did not abolish common identity. The cells faced the same great cloister. The bells reached each enclosure. Shared rules governed separate rooms. The arrangement made distance into a form of belonging rather than a release from it. No surprise waits in this solitude. There is simply a different balance between gathering and withdrawal. The monk will join prescribed worship. He will also return again to the cell, where eating, reading, prayer, work, and rest occupy a space arranged for one. The contrast makes the medieval monastery less tidy and more truthful. Our story now returns to the composite Benedictine dormitory. The lamp there continues to burn. Several sleepers breathe in no shared rhythm, yet the room as a whole has become still. The individual cell at Mount Grace and the communal dormitory belong to different customs, different architectures, and different experiences of night. Neither should become the single image of medieval monastic life. Nor should this episode's male settings erase communities of women, double houses in some earlier contexts, smaller priories, urban houses, or traditions beyond the Western examples followed here. The phrase medieval monastery covers more variety than one slow day can hold. Still, the day we have followed offers a useful thread. Bells divided time without making every schedule identical. The cloister connected rooms without sealing the community from the world. Meals joined discipline to bodily need. Work joined prayer to material maintenance. Books, infirmaries, and gates turned care into repeated tasks. Evening drew these strands back toward quiet. The rhythm may appear settled when told from a distance. Inside it, weather changed plans, illness granted exceptions, guests interrupted routine, harvest pressed upon prayer, and attention wandered. An ideal schedule did not make flawless people. It gave imperfect people a pattern to resume. That resumption is one reason rules endure in the record. They repeat instructions because life repeatedly drifts away from them. Be silent here. Gather there. Read at this interval. Care for this person. Put this object back. Open the door with gentleness. Return after distraction. The language of order follows the ordinary fact of disorder. Night makes that order simpler to hear. The day's workrooms have fallen quiet. The refectory benches are empty. The chapter house waits for another gathering. The garden paths exist beyond sight. Infirmary care and gate duty remain possible, but most movement has receded. The church also rests between offices. Books remain closed on their supports or stored according to the custom of the house. A flame trembles near the place where morning prayer will begin. Stone holds the coolness of the hour. The building seems still, though timber makes small sounds as temperatures change. In the dormitory, one sleeper wakes briefly and hears nothing that requires action. Another has not moved. Cloth rises and falls with breath. The lamp's pool of light remains near the floor, leaving the roof in darkness. The long room is both communal and private, filled with separate dreams that no rule can organize. When the next bell comes, it may arrive before daylight. The rules night office will gather the community again according to season and observance. Sleep will release people unevenly. Clothing is already arranged for rising. Feet will find the floor, lamps will guide the first steps, and the covered walk will receive them once more. We do not need to sound that bell yet. The interval before it is enough. It contains the last warmth kept beneath a blanket, the low flame, and the pause of a community between repeated duties. Outside, wind moves along the wall and spins itself among dark trees or open ground. At Mount Grace, separate lamps also fade or are tended within separate cells. At a women's house elsewhere, another dormitory settles beneath another roof. At a small poor priory, the room may be colder. At a wealthy abbey, more servants and stronger walls do not remove wakefulness. The night touches each arrangement without making them the same. History rarely preserves the exact minute when an unknown sleeper turned toward the wall. It preserves the rule, the ruin, the account, the book, and sometimes the complaint. From those remains, a day can be approached but not possessed. Our quiet reconstruction has walked close to the evidence and left its missing spaces unfilled. The missing spaces are restful. They allow the monastery to recede without a final revelation. No hidden door opens. No famous visitor arrives. The ordinary night is sufficient. A lamp burns lower. A draft crosses the floor. Stone returns the last trace of the day's warmth to the air. The bell from the beginning of our journey hangs motionless. Its rope is still. The communal dormitory, the chapter house, the refectory, the garden, the workroom, the infirmary, and the gate all wait within the same darkness. Their duties have not vanished. They have been placed down for a while. One person sleeps after labor. Another rests after reading. A caretaker listens for movement from the sick. A porter remains near the boundary. Far away in our counterpoint, a Carthusian monk sleeps within his cell and garden wall. The medieval night contains many forms of enclosure and many degrees of silence. Morning will bring no sudden transformation. There will be familiar words: bread, work, correction, fatigue, hospitality, and repair. The garden will require another glance. The book will open to another line. The door will receive whatever the road sends. Repetition will begin again, because repetition is what sustains the house. For now, even repetition is asleep. The page is closed. The bowl is clean. The tool is dry. The traveler has found a place. The patient lies beneath a covering, and the dormitory breathes in the faint amber light. The flame shortens, steadies, and shortens again. Shadows lose their edges. The stones remain cool and dependable beneath the dark, while the unsound bell waits without impatience for its appointed touch. The day inside the medieval monastery has returned to the place where it began, before daylight, among sleepers and a lamp. Nothing asks to be solved. There is only the slow breathing of the room, the soft pressure of night against the walls, and the long quiet before another measured hour. Thank you for spending the night in history with me. I'm the Yawning Historian. Good night.